Welcome, everybody, to everything you need to know about upcoming Azure certifications. Today, we're going to walk through the changes that have been announced for some of the in-market Azure certification exams. And when I say in-market, I mean those that are available through Microsoft that you can go and take through Pearson VUE or maybe sit at home in a proctored environment. I want to cover what is and what isn't changing as a part of the announcements Microsoft have made, what the impacts are to all of us as learners and Azure practitioners who take exams related to Azure, and what your next steps can potentially be based on some of these announcements. So let's start with what is and isn't changing within the current set of exams and certifications. I want to start with what isn't changing and then get into some of the material changes. With all of the certifications across the board, there's a large focus on aligning these roles and tested skills within the exams to real world tasks. And that part of the equation isn't changing at all. I think it's helpful if you understand how Microsoft comes up with some of these roles and where they align learning to. At Microsoft, they use an internal process known as Job Task Analysis, or JTA, to ensure that certifications are going to be both relevant and realistic for those who sit these exams. Microsoft works not only with internal resources, but also external subject matter experts and learning partners such as Upskility to ensure that all of these trainings, exams, and certifications are on the right path. That collaboration ultimately leads to the creation of a master set of skills and a learning path around a given role. Once that's defined, those paths are then backfilled with training and assessments. For training, there's microlearning from Upskility and Skill Me Up, as well as Microsoft and other third parties. At Upskility and Skill Me Up, we offer modules that then roll up to courses, that then roll up to learning paths, so that we can help you make sure you remain aligned in your learning. You can approach learning in a more structured way with online courses through Skill Me Up, or go down the instructor-led training path through Upskility. There are also books available for many of the exams and certifications that are out there today, but a little bit of personal opinion here, you do have to watch out for outdated material. The cloud moves at such a phenomenal pace, and I think you really do want to make sure that you have access to the latest materials, regardless of your preferred learning style. And once Microsoft has defined all of the training and potentially what a learning path looks like, that ultimately leads to an assessment in the form of a certification exam, which is where we'll focus from here on out. Another thing that isn't changing are the certification titles. To begin the Azure certifications, we have Azure Fundamentals. This is a certification that is optional, and it's not necessarily for those that already know Azure. It will introduce those that are new to Azure to the breadth of the Azure platform and ensure that they understand the fundamentals of cloud computing. It is a technical certification, but it's not hands-on, and it doesn't go as deep as any of the other certifications that we're going to talk about today. If we move beyond the fundamentals to the associate level certifications, this is where we'll see the role-based certifications, including Azure Administrator and Azure Developer, pop up. There are more certifications beyond what's listed here at the associate level that have been released over the last year, and there are more in the pipeline which will be released over the remainder of this calendar year and certainly oncoming years. Each of these certifications has a single exam behind it. So to become a certified Azure Administrator, you would sit for one test, and the same for the Azure Developer Associate. And that part also isn't changing. There are expert level certifications available as well. These certifications are backed by 2 exams, which is a little different than the associate exams that exist today. The difference here is one exam is technical and one is design based. And one last thing I'd like to touch on while we're here is prerequisites. When you're evaluating which certifications to approach, there are no prerequisites for the associate exams, as Azure Fundamentals is optional. There are also no prerequisites for the Azure Solutions Architect-backed exams. It's up to you to judge your skill level and when you're ready to go ahead and sit an exam. There is a prerequisite for the Azure DevOps exam, either the Azure Administrator or Azure Developer Associate. You don't need to take both to progress to the DevOps exams and that particular certification. So with all that being said, while Microsoft doesn't state official prerequisites for some certifications, I highly recommend that you honestly assess your skills with Azure before you move into the expert exams, such as those that lead to Azure Solutions Architect Expert. You'll find that even after the announced realignment of exam skills that we're going to cover today, it still may be in your interest to say, get your Azure Administrator Associate certification before you move on to the Azure Architect Technologies exam or Microsoft Azure Architect Design exams. Before we talk about specific changes to the certification exams, let's talk about timelines for when a new exam is released. Today, you have a current exam in the market. That exam is going to be replaced with a new exam. Once that new exam is released in beta, a 90-day clock starts. And after 90 days, the previous exam will be retired, and then what was the exam in beta becomes the current exam. So there is a body of time in here as Microsoft releases some of these new exams where you have the opportunity to potentially take the current exam if you are already studying for it, or if you haven't started studying, maybe you want to target to what is going to become the new exam along the way. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and discuss what is changing, starting with the exams that lead up to that Azure Administrator Associate certification. Today, the AZ-103 is in the market, and that's going to be replaced with the AZ-104 certification exam. There are no changes to the title of the associate certification, and it will still be called the Azure Administrator Associate. The new AZ-104 exam is expected to be released in beta in March 2020. So late March 2020, we expect to see that exam drop for the new AZ-104, and that's going to start the clock for that 90-day turnover between the current exam and the new exam. If we look at some of the differences in the high-level objective domains between the current AZ-103 exam and the newly announced AZ-104 exams, we can see that Microsoft has done just a little bit more than a light realignment of the objective domains and the skills that they test for within that exam. So where the AZ-103 had an entire domain related to identity, that has now been consolidated into a new objective domain that has skills that cover subscriptions, resources, identity, and governance. There's less emphasis on hybrid identity as a part of this transition from the AZ-103 to the AZ-104, as well as overall management of Azure Active Directory, but user group and device management has remained during that transition. For the storage domain, the overall weighting has dropped just a little bit, and implementing Azure Backup has been removed as a specific skill from the storage domain. The third domain, deploy and manage Azure Compute Resources, is where we start to see some of those really big changes. Note the removal of the phrasing virtual machines and the change to compute. So we've gone from deploy and manage virtual machines to deploy and manage Azure Compute. that's a pretty big clue that there are some things that we're going to need to take a look at within the skills. The AZ-103 role profile, back to that job task analysis and that profile that was generated, called out that the role focused primarily on enabling infrastructure as a service, or IaaS. In the AZ-104 role description, that language has been completely removed. So if compute resources is more than just virtual machines, what else does it include in the context of this exam? Well, beyond VMs, we also have skills for creating and configuring containers using both Azure Kubernetes Service, or AKS, and Azure Container Instances, or ACI, as well as skills for creating and configuring Azure App Service and App Service plans. This skill really zeroes in on Azure Web Apps and not Azure Functions, Logic Apps, or Event Grid, some things that you might run into sometimes in that PaaS space with app service plans. While the virtual networking domain carries the same weight, some skills have changed there as well. The AZ-103 really didn't focus on load balancing solutions beyond Azure Load Balancer. And in the AZ-104, you'll find much broader coverage, and it includes Azure Load Balancer and Azure Application Gateway. The skills around security have also been updated there with more of an emphasis on security services and resources in Azure, such as Azure Bastion and Azure Firewall. Now let's discuss the Azure Developer Associate certification. As of today, there are two exams in the market, the AZ-103 and the AZ-204 certification exam, which has replaced it. Just as with the previous certification, there are no changes in the title of this associate certification, and it will still be called the Azure Developer Associate. The new AZ-204 exam has already been released and was made available on February 24th, 2020. So that's when the clock started ticking for that 90-day countdown for that new exam. This is one of those ones where you do have an opportunity to potentially take the 203 if you've already been studying for that, or if you're just getting into it, you might want to look at the 204. If we look at some of the differences in the high-level objective domains between the AZ-203 and the AZ-204 exams, we see a pretty large realignment here as well, with the collapse of what was two separate objective domains and all the skills within them into one new objective domain that has a higher weighting. When I call out these weightings, it's really the percentage of questions or lab materials that you might have associated with one of these particular domains. So where the AZ-203 had separate objective domains for IaaS and PaaS solutions, there's now a single domain in the AZ-204 for Azure Compute Solutions, and it's inclusive of both IaaS and PaaS services. So much like the AZ-104, you'll find coverage for virtual machines and app service here, but they've also added in Azure Functions. The new storage domain, with its lower weighting, focuses on utilizing Cosmos DB as a storage platform, including the multiple APIs it supports, as well as developing solutions that leverage Azure Blob Storage. There's not any emphasis on developing solutions that use other parts of Azure Storage outside of blobs, such as tables, queues, or files. While the weighting for storage fell, the weighting for security did come up. Beyond implementing OpenID Connect and OAuth 2.0 for authentication and authorization, you'll also find that app configuration and Key Vault APIs are pretty pervasive. You'll also run into managed identities within this domain. And I think this is a good one to call out because we've just run into a new skill. So app configuration is a service that wasn't available when the AZ-203 was initially envisioned. And I think this speaks to how these exams are going to continually be updated as new services are released and they come out of preview and they go to GA. And once they've hit GA or general availability, they're 100% fair game to show up on an exam as Microsoft continues this realignment. The domain for monitor, troubleshoot, and optimize Azure solutions is still a bit of a hodgepodge. You're going to find Azure CDN here along with Redis Cache for optimization. You'll also see App Insights and Azure Monitor for monitoring solutions. And there are skills that still remain for implementing code to handle transient faults within applications that you develop in Azure. Under the final domain of connect to and consume Azure and third-party services, you'll find logic apps, API management, event grid, event hub, notification hubs, as well as Azure Service Bus and Azure Storage Queues. So earlier I mentioned that the domain for Azure Storage doesn't cover Azure Storage Queues. Somehow Azure Storage Queues made their way into connect to and consume Azure services and some of those other messaging components that do exist down there. Now let's discuss the Azure Solutions Architect certification. As of today, there are 2 exams in market, the AZ300 and the AZ301 certification exams, one that focuses on implementation and one that focuses on design. There are no changes to the title of the expert certification, and it will still be called the Azure Solutions Architect Expert. Also, there are no changes to the titles of the exams that lead to the certification outside of the updates in the numbering. Both the AZ300 and AZ301 exams are going to be replaced with the AZ303 and AZ304 exams, respectively. These new exams are expected to become available in late April 2020. And I just want to call out here that Microsoft also had to make some decisions about what to do with this particular certification, being that it had 2 exams that backed it. What they've decided on is you're going to be able to mix and match between the AZ300 or 303 and the AZ301 or 304. So if I take a step back, let's say that I've already gone and sat the exam for the AZ300 and I've passed it. So I have that exam all done and ready to go, but I don't think I have enough time to learn all the material and sit the exam for the AZ301. What Microsoft is going to let learners do instead is, like in that case, I could sit the AZ304. And if I sit the AZ304, that will absolutely count as a credit along with my AZ300 and ultimately add up to that overall Azure Solutions Architect Expert certification along the way. So there is a little bit more play and variability within those exams. The AZ300 and AZ301 transitions start to look even more interesting, perhaps, than some of the ones that we've already discussed. In the AZ303, we can see that implement and monitor an Azure infrastructure solution makes up at least 50% of the exam. Now, pay attention to some of the wording of these new objective domains as well. We can see that the AZ303 exam is still a technical exam focused on implementation. Anytime you see that word, implement or implementation, you can almost bet that you need to know not just how to create the services listed within the skills of each one of those domains, but also how to configure them. So in something like the AZ104, it might say create and configure a service for a skill. Over here, it just says implement, but most of the time it means the same thing. If we break down implement and monitor an Azure infrastructure, here you'll find not only security, performance, and cost solutions, but also some requirements around configuring advanced logging using App Insights and log analytics. You have to be mindful of where to focus on the configuration aspects with some of these, and especially this one. For example, here, while you're configuring a log analytics workspace, and that's something you'll definitely need to know, you won't need to know the ins and outs of constructing log analytics queries using Kusto or KQL. For something like Azure Monitor, it could go a little bit further though, and you'll need to know how not only to configure Monitor, but how to respond to alerts that you generate out of, say, an alert rule. In my opinion, the objective domain in these kind of first two objective domains in particular still bring a lot of overlap from the AZ 104 and AZ 204 exams. If anything, just because the architect exams still don't have any hard prerequisites before you can sit them. When you really dig into the skills required for these domains, you'll find that if you take the contents on compute services from the AZ 104 and map them over, you're almost better off taking the AZ 104 first and then coming to this exam, especially if you don't have the required experience with Azure. The domain implement, management, and security solutions is going to bring Azure Migrate, Azure Backup for VMs, and Azure Update Management to the front for the management component. Under load balancing and network security, you'll find not only Azure Load Balancer and Application Gateway, which we talked about in the 104, but here you'll also see Azure Firewall, Azure Front Door Service, Azure Traffic Manager, Azure Bastion, and network and application security groups. For the security component, you'll run into Key Vault and managed identities, which starts to sound eerily familiar to some of those exam skills that were found over in the 204. And I think that starts to, again, speak to some of that overlap potentially in skills between some of these exams. Implement solutions for apps is going to focus on app service, which is inclusive of Azure Functions and Logic Apps, as well as container-based application with coverage for Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure Container Instances, and Azure Container Registry. But there is no coverage for Azure Service Fabric. So no Service Fabric Mesh and no Service Fabric clusters. That has all gone away. Under data platforms, you'll find Cosmos DB and Azure SQL, including Azure SQL Managed Instance. Now, I want to be clear about that one. That one just calls out Azure SQL and SQL MI. It doesn't call out MySQL or Postgres or MariaDB, some of the other PaaS services that are supported within Azure SQL. So it is pretty Microsoft focused in that regard. And finally, that will bring us to the AZ301 versus the AZ304, where the AZ303 focused on implementation. The 304 is the exam that is all about design. Under design monitoring, you'll encounter design a solution for cost management and cost reporting, as well as design solutions for logging and monitoring. The logging and monitoring skill is going to bring forward some new services that you likely haven't encountered in any other Azure exams, if you haven't taken any yet, particularly services like Azure Sentinel. Note that this domain is not about resource-specific monitoring. It is about your all-up monitoring strategy. Design identity and security brings in some additional components with Azure AD, such as conditional access and MFA, but it doesn't include anything with Active Directory Federation services, so ADFS, or anything to do with federated Azure AD tenancies. The domain for design data storage is going to bring some new services with it as well, including some services such as Synapse Analytics, which is still in preview. So we'll have to see how some of that shakes out by the time these exams are released in late April. There are some specific callouts to things you don't need to know, including data caching strategies, mostly because that was already covered in the AZ303. And like I mentioned, MariaDB, Postgres, and MySQL won't really be brought up at all within that domain or any of the skills that you study for it. For the most part, design business continuity remains largely the same, but some of the skills have moved around. For the final domain of design infrastructure, you'll run into skills that are related to design, computing, and networking solutions, as well as application architectures using microservices. So keep in mind with something like the 303 exam, there was a focus on container-based solutions with AKS and ACI, and now that's carried forward from implementation over to design in this design infrastructure domain. For compute, there are callouts again to some things that you don't need to know, including monitoring, backups, recovery, availability, security, and storage. And just because those aren't a part of this objective domain doesn't mean they're not there as a part of the all-up certification, because really we talked about all of those things as a part of the AZ 303 or potentially as a part of other objective domains within the AZ 304 exam. In summary, here's how all of that comes together. A few things to note that aren't listed here. Initially, when Microsoft made the announcement about these exam updates, the AI 100 exam was going to be refreshed. That has been walked back for now. There are no planned changes to the AI 100 at this time. There are also no planned changes to some of those other Azure certifications that I brought up in the very beginning. So the AZ 900 and the AZ 400 are all staying the same as of right now. And that's all subject to change in the future, of course. There are a lot of other role-based exams that are in the market today as well. So there's more than the Azure exams. There's the MS exams, which focus on Microsoft 365, Office 365. There's the MD exams, which focus on modern desktop. There's the PL exams with Power Platform, DP with the data platform exams. You can absolutely expect that over time, those exams are going to be updated and refreshed as well. All right, so now that we know what's out today and what's coming next, let's talk about some of the potential impacts to you as you start to or continue your certification journey. Let's start with some of the skills you need to study for an exam. While the name of the certifications and the exams are not changing, those skills certainly are. So as I called out within each of those objective domains across all those exams, there are some pretty decent shifts within there. The updated exams are coming in beta, and a lot of that's because the measured skills are new. And they're going to have new questions to cover those skills, and they don't actually know if those questions are the right questions to ask. But if you're thinking about sitting down and taking the certification or the exam that leads to the certification, at the end of the day, if you can pass the exam, you're going to get the same certification and the same claim badge. So the You're a Claim badge that you can post on LinkedIn that includes it looks exactly the same as the old one. The only difference is going to be that the skills associated with the badge are going to be different. So if you're out there and you can go ahead and pass the AZ 103 today, go ahead and sit it. And if you pass it, you'll get your certification, you'll get your badge, and that exam and that certification are good for 2 years. It's just because the AZ 104 is coming doesn't mean that all of the hard work that you've put into something like the 103 is going to be thrown away or it doesn't count for anything. That's absolutely not the case as these new exams come out. There are also a lot of us that study using publicly available materials, such as those from Microsoft Learn. For Microsoft specifically and materials within Microsoft Learn, Microsoft has publicly stated that the materials available through MS Learn are going to be updated within 7 days of the release of a new exam. And just when you think about that new materials might not be there on day one when the exam drops. You have to keep in mind the new exams are going to run in beta for at least 90 days. So not being there on day one hopefully doesn't have too much of an impact on your progress, especially if you can focus on objective domains or skills within those domains that were the same as they were in a previous exam. So if I look at the AZ 204 and I find the parts that are the same as the 203, those learning materials from Microsoft will still be out there and ready to go and lined up. So you've got these new exams inbound, and you probably have some decisions to make. Let's talk through some of your options and how you can strategize for this change, whether you're already in the process of studying for an existing exam or you're just getting started. If you're studying for an existing exam today, your best bet is probably to keep on going. Now, I should couch all this. This is just my advice, and your situation might be a little bit different. So ultimately, what you do is up to you. Just to run through a quick example, even if you're studying for the AZ-203 and that AZ-204 is out and available today, you still do have that 90 days to sit the current exam and apply all of your learnings. Say you sit your exam and you don't pass it. That's okay too. You can still retake it as the AZ-203. And like I said, if you pass, you'll get your certification and it's still good for 2 years from the date you pass it. Now, if you're just getting started, I would target the new exams. There's a body of knowledge that you need to acquire to be successful on these exams. And realistically, 90 days might not be enough for you to gain all of that knowledge, especially if you have other commitments outside of upskilling for a particular certification exam, or you don't have any experience with cloud computing already, either from Microsoft with Azure or from another public cloud provider like Amazon with AWS or Google with GCP. While there are no official prerequisites for these new exams, there is actually some guidance from Microsoft that can be found in the updated exam outlines. So in the past, they would have just called out that here's a role and we think you should be an administrator or a developer, and here's some skills you should go take a look at. What they've done now in the new role descriptions is they've actually called out how long they think you should potentially be in that role, or how long you should be hands-on day to day with the technologies that you're targeting in a particular exam. For example, for the AZ-104 and the AZ-204 exams, Microsoft recommends that you have at least 6 months of hands-on experience with the skills that are covered in the exam. And for the expert level exams, that you should really have an expert level understanding of the contents. That can certainly be a little bit fuzzy sometimes, but if you're looking to start with something like the AZ-303, so you just want to dive right into that architecture and solutions expert certification, but you've never touched Azure or another cloud provider before, you might actually be better served by starting with the AZ-900 Azure Fundamentals exam and working your way up. So you can pass some of those earlier exams and build confidence as you work your way ultimately towards those expert exams on the other side. At Upskility, our goal is to make certification preparation easy with multiple paths available to students, including instructor-led and on-demand training in Azure and Microsoft 365. We are in the process of updating all of our material for the AZ-104, AZ-204, AZ-300, and AZ-304 as I speak, and the release of those contents is imminent. With the AZ-204 in the market, we're really excited to be one of the first learning partners to have our refreshed material available. And for the other exams, our intent is to be ahead of the curve. For individuals or teams who are looking to take these exams, we have a learning platform that can meet your needs with both instructor-led training through Upskility and virtual training through Upskility, as well as on-demand computer-based training and labs available through Skill Me Up. If you do have a team, as a learning partner, we can also help you order and manage certification vouchers for your employees, making it easy to purchase vouchers in bulk and distribute them to your team members as they complete their learning paths and they're ready to sit for those exams. We also have real-time labs and both guided and unguided available at any time through our on-demand learning platform, Skill Me Up. These aren't just sandboxes, they are guided and unguided labs that let you get the skills you need to be successful with not only these Microsoft exams, whether they're Office 365 or Azure certification exams, but also to be successful in your day job and ultimately your career. If you've ever wanted to try something out, but you don't have access to an Azure subscription, our lab engine gives you a platform where you always do. Our subscriptions allow you to do unlimited labs and don't require anything other than a web browser. If you've never seen Skill Me Up or you haven't tried our labs, I encourage you all to take it for a spin with just a 10-day, no obligation trial. Here are a few links for you. As I said, we're rapidly updating our courseware. And in fact, the first course of the AZ 104 is already online today within Skill Me Up with both on-demand videos and real-time labs available. For the 104, our goal is to get all of our material for that, all the courses and all the labs out within the next 2 weeks. Again, we want to beat that deadline of that exam coming out in late March. And for the AZ 204, we recognize that one is out there today. That material will be going online very quickly. We're expediting that one as fast as we can. And our goal there is to have that available by late March as well. If you're looking to really take a deep dive on some of the things I talked about today with the realignment of skills within a given exam, I encourage you to go to Microsoft Learn to get all of the detail about each of those exams that I've discussed here today. For example, you could browse into the AZ 204 exam and you can download a PDF which includes the full exam outline, so all the objective domains, all the skills, and Microsoft has been pretty nice here. They've actually offered redline versions of those summaries, so you can see what has changed from one exam to the next as they come out and they get ready to drop. Thanks for taking the time today as we went through the changes that have been announced for some of the in-market Azure certification exams. We covered what is and isn't changing as a part of the announcements that Microsoft has made, what the impacts are to all of us as learners and Azure practitioners who take exams related to Azure, and we walk through what some of your next steps can be based on those announcements. Thanks for joining us today for everything you need to know about upcoming Azure certification changes. If you have any questions, feel free to enter those in the questions window or in the chat, and I can go ahead and get those answered for you. There was a question in the chat, why do you think they changed the focus from virtual machines to compute for AZ 104? Honestly, I think they changed it because that's the reality of working in Azure. It's very hard to be just a pure infrastructure person these days. For example, if I work with virtual machines, so I go ahead and create a virtual machine, that virtual machine's OS disk and data disks are ultimately backed by Azure storage accounts, which are a PaaS service. So no matter what, even though I tried to be IaaS and use just VMs, I ultimately ended up in PaaS from a storage perspective. I think it makes sense to add some of the other things in there, particularly compute services that are built on top of VMs. So if you look at the two things, really the three that they added in there, so they added Azure Web Apps and AKS and ACI. AKS is ultimately built on top of virtual machine scale sets. So you're dealing with VM scale sets within your node pools within that service. So if you know how to manage VM scale sets, you should learn how to manage AKS as well. It will serve you along pretty well along the way. For something like ACI, again, ACI is compute constrained. You have memory and CPU constraints within there. And if you're just a developer, you might not look those things up, but I think it behooves us as administrators or IT pros to be able to closely align with our development teams and help guide them through some of that. There's another question in the chat. What is the typical time between updates to Microsoft certifications? How long is there between updates? Is it on a fixed schedule, or does Microsoft just change them at will? Well, there is no fixed timeline today. We're kind of expecting that as new services are released and there's a critical mass of maybe new services within a given area, that we'll see updates made to those exams. I think for the most part, we're seeing updates be made within 9 months to a year. And you could potentially see that accelerate a little bit. I'm not sure Microsoft really new, honestly, when they announced some of this. It was ultimately a new path to go on with these role-based certifications. So what happens today is that exam comes out, you sit it, and you pass it, you get your cert. That cert is good for 2 years. Microsoft hasn't talked about what's going to happen when that 2 years is up. Is there going to be a transition exam for you to take? Are you going to have to resit a full version of the exam? Some of that's just up in the air, and hopefully we'll see that bake out over time. At the end of the day, I think it really doesn't matter so much when they get updated, because the expectation is that you're not just taking these exams to take the exams and get a piece of paper. You're taking these exams because you work in Azure every day and you're looking to build a body of knowledge and the retention, the retention of skills around certain areas. So if I sit the AZ 104 and I can pass that, I know those things, hopefully I'm working with those technologies all up day in, day out. So say the AZ 104 revs and it becomes the AZ 105 because they added a new service. It shouldn't theoretically be too big a deal because I've already probably worked with 90% of it day in and day out. So hopefully it doesn't become too much of an operational burden there. Doesn't look like we have any more questions in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and close this down. Thanks again, and we hope to see you soon.